Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We're always getting questions about food and health, and today we're tackling a big one, type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, this one comes up a lot.
Right. So we're not just skimming the surface here. We've got this mountain of research you guys have sent in, studies, articles, all sorts of stuff, and we're going deep.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole, isn't it? I mean, there's so much to unpack, from cocoa to figs to herbs I can't even pronounce.
Seriously. But that's why we're here, right? To sort through it all, pull out the gems, and give you the need to know on how food can actually play a role in managing T2D.
Exactly. We're going to talk about what actually works, what's promising, and what's still up in the air. No sugarcoating here.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly are we dealing with when we talk about type 2 diabetes? I mean, we hear the term all the time, but can you break it down for us? So it's basically a metabolic disorder, right? It all comes down to insulin. That's the hormone that helps our cells absorb glucose sugar from the blood for energy. In type 2 diabetes, there are two main problems. Either the body isn't producing enough insulin, or, and this is more common, that cells become resistant to insulin. They're like, nah, we're good. We don't need that sugar right now.
They developed a sweet tooth, but forgotten how to use the sugar.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And that leads to high blood sugar, which we call hyperglycemia.
Okay, that's the problem. But why should we care? What's the big deal if our blood sugar is a bit high?
Well, the problem is that over time, that chronically high blood sugar can do some serious damage. We're talking about damage to blood vessels, nerves, organs, increases the risk of heart disease, stroke, kidney problems, even vision loss. And unfortunately, it's a growing problem worldwide.
I was actually really surprised by the numbers. I mean, it's not just a handful of people.
It's mind-boggling, actually. The WHO data we looked at from 2016 shows that globally, the number of adults with diabetes went from about 108 million in 1980 to a whopping 422 million by 2014.
That's a huge jump. I mean, that's more than quadrupled in just a few decades.
And the East Mediterranean region saw the biggest increase, percentage-wise. But in terms of sheer numbers, it's the Western Pacific, followed by Southeast Asia, that have the most people living with diabetes. So yeah, it's definitely a global health challenge, to put it mildly.
Okay, so we know what type 2 diabetes is, we know it's a serious issue, and we know it's affecting more and more people. But before we get into the specifics of these medicinal foods and herbs, can we just step back for a second and talk about how sugar is normally processed in the body? I feel like understanding that will help us appreciate how these natural remedies might fit in.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's break it down. So imagine you eat a meal with carbs. Those carbs get broken down in the small intestine into simple sugars, mainly glucose, with the help of enzymes called alpha-glucosidases. They're like little Pac-Man, chomping away at those complex carbs.
So these alpha-glucosidases are kind of like the key to unlocking the sugar from our food.
Right. And once that glucose is free, it gets absorbed into the bloodstream through the cells lining the small intestine. But here's the interesting part. If we have undigested carbs, like fiber, that can actually slow down this absorption process. It's like adding a speed bump on the glucose highway.
So fiber is good for more than just, keeping things regular.
Definitely. Now, once that glucose is in the bloodstream, our bodies have a couple of options. One is to store it for later. That's where glycogen comes in. The liver is a major storage site for glycogen, keeping our blood sugar stable between meals. Our muscles also store glycogen, but mainly for their own use during exercise.
So the liver is the national reserve of sugar, and the muscles have their own local stash.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Now, if our blood sugar drops too low, the body has another trick up its sleeve. It can create new glucose from other sources, like lactic acid. This is called gluconeogenesis, and it mainly happens in the liver and kidneys.
So we've got the system of storing and creating sugar to keep everything balanced. But what about insulin and glucagon? Where do they fit in?
Hormones are like the master regulators of this whole process. Insulin, which is released by the pancreas when blood sugar rises, is the key player. It tells our cells to take up glucose from the blood, encourages the liver to store it as glycogen, and puts the brakes on gluconeogenesis. So insulin is the store-it hormone.
And glucagon is the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. Glucagon steps in when blood sugar levels drop too low. It tells the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose back into the bloodstreams, like a reserve tank being tapped into. So glucagon is the release-it hormone. And these two hormones are constantly working together, like a finely tuned thermostat, to keep blood sugar levels in that sweet spot.
And it all gets messed up. Type 2 diabetes when insulin isn't working properly.
Right. Either there isn't enough of it, or the cells aren't responding to it like they should. That's why managing blood sugar is so crucial in T2D.
Okay, that was a great course on sugar metabolism. Now let's get to the good stuff. We've heard a lot about cocoa lately. Is it really as good for T2D as some people claim?
Well, it's not a magic cure, but there's definitely growing interest in the potential of cocoa, especially the kind that's rich in flavonoids. There have been some promising human studies suggesting that these flavonoids might actually help improve blood pressure, reduce insulin resistance, and even improve lipid profiles, which is important for heart health.
So we're not talking about your average bar here, right?
Definitely not. We're talking about dark chocolate, the kind with a high percentage of cacao solids. The more processed the chocolate, the fewer beneficial flavonoids it'll have.
Good to know. And are there any studies that stand out in terms of showing a benefit for people with T2D?
There was this European study that found a link between a higher intake of certain flavonoids, like flavin-3 monomers and low polymerization proanthocyanidins, as well as myostatin, and a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And there's other research showing that epicatogen, which is abundant in cocoa, can actually help reverse some markers of oxidative stress in the muscles of people with both T2D and heart failure.
So it's not just about diabetes, but potentially helping people who already have it.
Right. And there's even a study that showed that a single dose of cocoa, so not even long-term consumption, actually increased good cholesterol and insulin levels in people with T2D after they ate a high-fat meal.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, who doesn't love chocolate?
Exactly. It's like a guilt-free treat almost. But of course, moderation is key. Even with dark chocolate, you don't want to overdo it.
Okay, so cocoa seems promising. What about another one?
It's fat content. But the fleshy part, the mesocarp, is actually loaded with phenolic acids and flavonoids. We're talking about things like salicylic acid, gallic acid, ferulic acid, catechin, epicatechin, quercetin. The list goes on.
Wow, that's a lot of big words. Take it they're all good things.
Well, many of them are known for their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. And while we don't have specific studies yet on how this exact combination in coconut affects TTD, the presence of these beneficial molecules is definitely intriguing.
Okay, so it's not a proven treatment, but it's definitely on.
Exactly. And who doesn't love a little coconut flavor?
All right, what else is on the menu?
How about figs? Not just they have some serious potential for managing T2D. Animal studies have shown that fig fruit can help lower blood sugar and improve cholesterol levels, lipid profiles, and even liver and kidney function.
Figs. Seriously, I never would have guessed.
I know, right? And it gets even more interesting. There's actually a lot of research specifically looking at fig leaves for their anti-diabetic effects.
So both the fruit and the leaves might be...
That seems to be the case.
Yeah.
And in lab studies, fig fruit extracts have shown antioxidant activity and have been able to inhibit certain enzymes, including alpha-glucosidase.
Wait, alpha-glucosidase, isn't that the enzyme earlier, the one that helps break down carbs into sugar?
You got it. And inhibiting that enzyme is actually a key mechanism of action for several anti-diabetic medications. It slows down the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So figs might be working in a similar way to some drugs.
That's pretty cool. So we might be getting some of those same benefits by eating figs.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, so we've got cocoa, coconut, figs. Anything else?
Oh yeah, there's moringa. 2 species actually. Moringa oleifera and Moringa stenopetala. Studies on M. oleifera leaf extracts, especially in animals, have shown some really promising results for diabetes. Things like improving glucose tolerance, increasing insulin levels, and even inhibiting those nasty advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, that can lead to complications.
I've heard of moringa. It's like a superfood.
It's definitely gaining popularity. And there's some good science emerging to support its use. Fermented preparations of M. oleifera are also showing promise in research.
Interesting. And what about M. stenopetala?
Well, that one seems to be rich in a compound called rutin, which has shown some antioxidant and protective effects on beta cells, the ones that produce insulin. And it seems to work in a few different ways to help manage blood sugar.
Okay, so moringa is another one to keep an eye on. Your sources also mentioned soybeans, sweet potato, and walnuts, but there wasn't as much detail on those.
Yeah, those were just briefly touched on as emerging T2D modulators. Seems like there's growing interest in their potential, but more research is needed.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about herbal supplements. I mean, there are so many out there marketed for diabetes. What's the real deal with those?
That's where things get a little tricky. While many herbal medicines have a long history of traditional use, the scientific evidence to support their use for managing T2D specifically can be hit or miss.
So just because it's natural doesn't mean it works.
We have to be careful with that assumption. Your source has highlighted a bunch of these supplements like aloe vera, andrographis, paniculata, banaba, and cassia, or senna species. And honestly, the jury's still out on those. More research is needed.
It's a bit of a wild west out there, isn't it?
Kind of, yeah. Popular ones like ginkgo biloba and St. John's wort don't have a ton of solid evidence to support their use for T2D either.
So what about ginseng? I've heard good things about that.
An interesting one. Ginseng, it contains these compounds called ginsenosides, which are a type of terpenoid, and other terpenoids, like ursolic acid, are being studied for their potential anti-diabetic effects. So there's definitely some potential there.
Okay, so maybe not. What about
Gymnema sylvestre is another one that's been used traditionally to help manage blood sugar. Jamun and olive leaf extract are also in that category, being investigated, but not quite proven.
It sounds like we need to be cautious about these herbal supplements.
I think that's a good takeaway. It's important to talk to your doctor before starting any new supplements, especially if you're already on medication for diabetes. There can be interactions and side effects to consider.
Good point. Now, one thing that came up a lot in the research was stress. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to type 2 diabetes?
Sure. So oxidative stress is basically an imbalance in the body. We have these harmful molecules called reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and reactive nitrogen species, RNS. Think of them as little troublemakers, causing damage to our cells. And normally, our bodies have antioxidants to fight them off, like a little army defending against these invaders. But in TQD, that high blood sugar actually leads to an increase in ROS and RNS production. It's like the enemy is getting stronger.
So the body's defenses are getting overwhelmed.
That's right. Oxidative stress is linked to a lot of the complications associated with diabetes, like kidney problems, damage to small blood vessels, and nerve damage.
Yikes. That's scary. So what can we do about it?
Some of those natural compounds we talked about earlier might come in handy. Many of them, like the flavonoids in cocoa and the phenolic acids in coconut, have antioxidant properties. They can help boost our body's defenses and fight off those damaging molecules.
So it's like giving our internal army some extra reinforcement. Now, while we've been focusing on individual foods and herbs, I think it's important to remember that managing type 2 diabetes is usually a multi-pronged approach, right?
Absolutely. It's rarely just one thing that does the trick.
So these foods and herbs are more like tools in the toolbox, not a standalone solution.
They can be part of a larger strategy that includes things like medication, regular exercise, and of course, a healthy diet overall.
And speaking of medication, it's fascinating how some of these drugs are based on the body's natural processes.
Oh, absolutely. It's like nature gave us the blueprint and science is figuring out how to use it.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So, for example, remember those SGLT2 transporters we talked about earlier, the ones involved in glucose absorption? Well, there's a whole class of drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors that work by blocking these transporters in the kidneys, which helps lower blood sugar. And the cool thing about these drugs is they don't depend on insulin to work, so they can be really helpful even in more advanced stages of T2D.
Wow, so we're essentially mimicking a natural process with medication.
And another example is DPPIV inhibitors. DPPIV is an enzyme.
That's clever. It's like we're hacking the system to make it work better.
And then there are receptor agonists, which mimic the effects of other incretin hormones. So yeah, a lot of these medications are directly inspired by what our bodies already do naturally.
It's amazing how much we can learn from the natural world.
It's not just about copying those processes exactly. It's about understanding the underlying mechanisms and finding ways to enhance or manipulate them for therapeutic benefit.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the complexities of type 2 diabetes, benefits of certain foods like cocoa, figs, and moringa, and the need for caution with herbal supplements. We've also explored how oxidative stress plays a role in T2D and how some of these natural compounds might help protect us from its damaging effects. And we've even touched on how our understanding of the body's natural glucose control mechanisms has led to the development of new medications.
Yeah, we've gone deep.
We definitely have. But I think the most important takeaway is that this is just the beginning. There's still so much to learn about the potential of food and herbs for managing T2D.
Absolutely, and it's an exciting area of research.
And for you, our amazing listeners, I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. What questions do you have? What foods or herbs piqued your interest? We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation.
Yeah, let us know what you're thinking.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains
Thanks for joining us
on this incredible journey into the world of food and health.
See you next time.